Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. It's so wonderful to see so many people joining us. Welcome to the global impact of the Dobbs decision on abortion laws, policies, narratives, and movements, findings from Colombia, India, Kenya, and Nigeria. My name is Bergen Cooper. I am the Director of Policy Research with Fòs Feminista. My colleague, Catherine Oliveira, Associate Director for US Global Advocacy, and I are thrilled to moderate this event today. Before we begin, a bit of housekeeping. We have simultaneous interpretation in French, Spanish, and Portuguese. To access the interpretation, please click the globe at the bottom right of your screen and select the language of your choice. I am thrilled to introduce Giselle Carreño, the founding CEO of Fòs Feminista. For more than 20 years, she has sought to mobilize change for reproductive justice across the global South by building connections, amplifying voices, and establishing new ways to more effectively meet the complex intersecting needs of women, girls, and gender diverse people. Giselle has guided our organization through a period of transformation to become an intersectional feminist alliance for sexual and reproductive health and rights and justice. Giselle, let me hand it over to you.
Hello. It's a pleasure to be here today. It would only be better if we could do it in person. I see all of you, and I know we'll make it work to be able to have to hear each other and to have a dialogue. As many of you know, Fòs Feminista is an intersectional feminist organization centered around sexual reproductive rights and needs of women, girls, and gender diverse people, led and governed by the Global South. We currently work as an alliance of 220 organizations in 40 countries worldwide to advance reproductive justice. As the connecting fabric of this alliance, Fòs organizes transnational and transregional action, amplifies partners' work, promotes South-South learning and collaboration towards achieving our common agenda. Together with our partners, we do provide access to sexual and reproductive health care in clinics, in digital communities, in real communities, including contraception, abortion, care for survivors of gender-based violence. We reach young people with comprehensive sex education, and we recognize the ability of women, girls, and gender diverse people to make free and informed choices about our lives, including access to safe and legal abortion is absolutely central to our life plans, to our own citizenship, and to achieving gender and reproductive justice. As such, we are at the forefront of advocating for this with an intersectional lenses in national, regional, and global spaces, coordinating with our partners to ensure that this lived experience, these diverse voices, priorities are represented and heard in these spaces. As you know, from Argentina, my own country, to India, to Sierra Leone, to Thailand, all over the world, feminists are leading and winning perhaps the most important fights, and certainly those to liberalize abortion laws. I often say the feminist movement has proved to be one of the most transformative movements in the world. And since 1994, only 4 countries have removed legal access to abortion: El Salvador, Nicaragua, Poland, and of course, the US. In all of these countries, we see attacks to sexual and reproductive health and rights, as we see democracy debilitating, and that's of course a very concerning trend. And we know that the struggles for sexual and reproductive health and rights and justice across the world are deeply interconnected. That's why when we founded FOSS as an organization that will fight against systems of oppressions that are interconnected: patriarchy, colonialism, and racism. And within this context, the US has a very disproportionate effect, both because of it is an economic superpower and the world's largest donors for global health initiatives. And for about half a century, Roe versus Wade stood as an important precedent for advancing rights to abortion in other parts of the world. And of course, its overturning is already producing effects internationally, as one would expect. And so we will hear all about it in a minute. Anti-abortion, anti-gender, anti-rights groups in other countries have seized this opportunity, the overturn of Roe, as a new reference point for promoting their agenda, for putting at risk hard-won victories for decriminalizing abortion, and of course threatening to disrupt judicial, legislative, and social change processes on abortion. Rooted in the needs and lived experiences of the people in the Global South, which its findings are, Fòs Feminista will continue to work, of course, in Washington, D.C., to ensure that the US government prioritizes and realizes gender equality, women's rights in all foreign policy efforts and initiatives. Many of you know Fòs is a word coming from Haitian Creole, means strength. We never doubted that we are strong and that we are stronger together. That's why we formed this alliance. And I really look forward to the findings, to the conversation that the findings will elicit. And so we can actually drive more and better resourcing to our partners and create more innovative strategies to advance. So really look forward to the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Giselle. And you are absolutely right. We are stronger together. So with that note, I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker. Ambassador Delphine O is Ambassador at Large and Secretary General for the Generation Equality Forum, Beijing +25. She led the organization of the largest international summit for women's rights since 1995, convened by UN Women and co-chaired by France and Mexico. She was previously a member of Parliament for La République En Marche, elected in Paris. She's a French-American Young Leader 2019, Munich Young Leader 2019, member of the Council at the Council on Foreign Relations, member of the Strategic Orientation Board at the German Marshall Fund, France, and a board member of IRIS. Ambassador O, welcome. Ambassador O, are you able to, we are having a quick internet problem with Ambassador O. So what we're going to do is, Ambassador O, we are going to move on to hear findings from Kemi. And then Ambassador O, we will hear from you as soon as you are back online. So please let me introduce my colleague, Kemi Akinfederin, who is the Chief Global Advocacy Officer with Fòs Feminista. Kemi brings more than 20 years experience working in partnership with women's rights organizations, funds, and feminist and social justice movements across Africa and globally. Throughout her career, she has been an activist for sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice, and has built close relationships with feminist sexual and reproductive health rights organizations and leaders in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Caribbean, and the Pacific. She began her career as a sexual and reproductive health and rights activist in her 20s when she co-founded Education as a Vaccine in Nigeria to advance adolescents and young women's rights to health, including sexual and reproductive health and rights. Kemi, let me hand it over to you to discuss these very exciting findings.
No problem. Thanks so much, Perking. It's always a pleasure to be in community with everyone, and particularly today, as we're discussing the impacts of the Dobbs decision on abortion laws, policies, narratives, and movements. As you know, this particular research, we did it in partnership with our partners from Colombia, India, Kenya, and Nigeria, and you'll have an opportunity to be able to meet with them and to hear directly from them about the implications and some of the key recommendations from this research. But we're also doing this in partnership with the Action Coalition on Bodily Autonomy and Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights, under the Generation Equality Forum. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to present these findings to you and to just share some of the key pieces that we think it's really important for us to think about as we continue to support feminist movements who are at the front line of advancing an intersectional sexual reproductive health, rights, and justice agenda. Next slide, please, Kat. So before I begin, I just want to kind of share with you and give you a bit of context around, global health funding by the United States government in the 4 countries that we, did this research in. So we have, you can look at the slide there, you can see that the lion's share of funding going to Nigeria and Kenya, and less so in terms of India and Colombia. But this was also one of the key reasons also why we selected these countries, because we wanted to also see a wide range of investments and commitments by the US government, in addition to, of course, the current context, legal context, and policy context for access to abortion in each of these countries, which also varies across the 4 countries, with, of course, Colombia having the most liberal laws and Nigeria having the most restrictive on the other spectrum. Thank you. Next slide, please, Kat. So in terms of the countries, actually I've just shared that with you, but also to just share with you in terms of the methodology and some of the core research questions we're hoping to achieve through this study. We wanted to learn more about the impact in terms of policy and law formulation, but also in terms of the implementations of laws and policy. So that was one of the core research questions that we were interested in. The second one was to look at, what impacts is Dobbs having in terms of public narratives? And we know that public narratives is very critical in terms of shaping ideas and thoughts around access to abortion, and that in itself has impacts in terms of influencing decision makers, but also influencing different stakeholders in different countries to be able to support reproductive rights. The third research question we wanted to learn more about was, what's the impact or the effects on movement? And looking at this in terms of movements, both in terms of the anti-rights and anti-abortion movements, but also looking at what are the impacts on feminist movements themselves. So we utilize a qualitative method, drawing on review of literatures, interviews, and also media monitoring. And we made sure that in terms of our approach, we ensured high integrity, high quality of the findings. We sought the perspectives and realities of a diverse and intersectional range of actors. And also we ensured that we mitigated ethical risk in terms of the research focal points, but also being very conscious of the dynamics, the national dynamics around sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice on the ground. And that you already have on your slide right now on the screen, just a summary of the number of respondents that we looked at across the different, I would say, different stakeholder groups, but also across the countries. We completed a total of 70 interviews, and this took place between March and April of this year. Following those, the interviews basically happened after we also did an initial literature review, and we had 2 amazing consultants that supported us through this process to make that happen. For the media monitoring, we also did a global search as well using Google News and MockRack in terms of English, Hindi, and Spanish. And we're able to pull all of this together into the different, to be able to respond to the different research questions that I had shared with you earlier. So I hope that this gives you at least enough context and background in terms of, how we got to this point. And now I'm excited to just move on directly to the findings itself. Please go ahead, Kat. The next slide, please. So the previous slide. Can you go back to the previous slide? Thank you. So the first thing we looked at, as I mentioned, is the impacts on policy laws in terms of formulation, but also implementation. And one of the things that we realized for example, in a country like Kenya, that while anti-abortion sentiments were already high at national level, that what we saw was Dobbs shifted attitudes and increased anti-abortion mobilization in many of the counties. And so in Kenya, when we spoke to respondents, they told us about how the anti-rights and anti-abortion advocates are using the overturn of Dobbs to persuade the courts to agree to an application of stay to the Malindi case. Many of you might not know about the Malindi case, but just for background, in May 2022, the High Court in Malindi affirmed abortion as a fundamental right under the Constitution of Kenya. And the judge, when writing for the court, drew from various international laws on abortion, including Roe versus Wade. And following the overturn of Roe versus Wade, opposition sees that as an opportunity to claim that he relied on a bad law. And in doing so, they were able to successfully persuade the courts of appeal to agree to an application to stay the implementation of the Malindi judgment and the policy directives that came out of that. So this is just one very concrete example that we saw in Kenya. Another example that we also saw in Kenya, and different actors cited the fact that since the overturn of Roe versus Wade, the anti-rights and anti-abortion groups have been using that to advance their agenda. So for example, in Kisumu County, interviewees reported that policymakers wanted to drop or were exploring dropping safe abortion as one of the lists of causes of maternal mortality, and question if this is the time to focus on safe abortion instead of trying to block it like the United States and emulating the actions of the United States. And as you see on your screen, one of the respondents described that in Kenya, and in responding to the Dobbs, saying that the anti-rights and anti-abortion movement see this as an exciting time, right? That this is exciting, that the US was able to overturn such a long-standing piece of law. And it would be easy, if this can happen in the United States, that it would be easy for Kenya. This would be a walk in the park to be able to push back against reproductive justice in the country. Next slide, please. We also saw similar actions in Nigeria and implications on policy in Nigeria. Dobbs was used as one of the arguments against the domestication of the safe termination of abortion for legal indication guidelines in Lagos, which is one of the states in Nigeria. And what we saw that the Dobbs and the anti-guideline mobilization were linked. We actually saw anti-rights actors specifically writing public letters to the governor and putting pressure on the governor at a time where things were extremely sensitive, because at that particular time, the Nigerians were going to the poll, and it was an election year and an election period. And that pressure from the Catholic Church, from some of the anti-rights actors, led the governor of Lagos State, who was running for re-election, to suspend the guidelines on the 18th of July, which was just merely 9 days after its launch. And, we can see that through the process that the Christian Association of Nigeria, led by the Catholic Church, mobilized. And one of the Archbishop of Lagos was asking the state governor to take action against the implementation and the domestication of the national guidelines. And particularly his quote was, at a time when the United States and other more advanced countries were reviewing their position on the legalization of abortion, as seen in the recent judgment of the Supreme Court of the United States of America on this matter. Why is it that Nigeria wants to move the agenda forward? Even though, and you can obviously note from that statement that abortion is allowed in Nigeria, and so he obviously did not understand the legal context, and that this was just a policy providing guidelines to health providers to be able to provide safe termination of abortion. And so you can see how the anti-rights movements were specifically able to target this particular piece of policy and the implications it had. Next slide, please, Kat. But I would also say, even though we've seen in Nigeria and in Kenya, like the direct impact on reproductive health and reproductive rights policy, we also saw that the opposition and the anti-rights movement were also trying to use this in other forms of policy related to sexual reproductive health, rights, and justice. And in the case of India, what we saw from our media monitoring was that we learned that during the hearings around India's same-sex marriage, that the Solicitor General actually referenced Dobbs' decision to argue against the same-sex marriage law that was being, being considered in that moment in time, and suggested that that this issue should actually be left to Parliament and not be taken to the courts. But similar, and basically citing that similar to what we saw in the United States, in which Dobbs' decision returned the issues of abortion to the state. But what we also saw was that a Chief Justice in India rebuked the citation and actually pushed back, responding that, we cannot cite Dobbs here, and that India has gone far beyond Dobbs, and fortunately so. And it's important that we give credit to ourselves as we have gone further than Western countries. So you can see how actors were also trying to use this particular, the Dobbs decision as a way to also impact on other sort of SRHR and sexual rights considerations and policies and legislation that goes beyond just reproductive justice. Next slide, please, Karen. So another piece that came out that was very clear and extremely saddening for us, given the years of work that we've done as Fòs Feminista around the global gag rule, including, several research that we've done through the predecessor organizations that led to our organization. And this is really looking at the interaction between the global gag rule and the Dobbs decision. So one of the things we heard from interviewees across Colombia, Kenya, and Nigeria was that the Dobbs decision has already built on already existing recent foundation of anti-rights and anti-abortion mobilization that originated from the United States during the implementation of the global gag rule. And that, with the Trump's administration's imposition of the global gag rule, which is a US foreign policy that prohibits foreign non-governmental organizations that receive any type of funding or assistance from the United States from providing, advocating for, or providing counseling, or even referring for abortion. And what we heard from interviewees was that the global gag rule had already weakened SRJ movements and actually strengthened anti-rights movement. And even though we've seen that the Biden administration has revoked the global gag rule and has stated that its administration is committed to promoting sexual reproductive health domestically and globally, we see that the Dobbs decision is still having the Dobbs decision is still interacting and engaging with the relics of what happened under the Trump administration with the global gag rule, even though the gag rule has been withdrawn. And so, interviewees expressed concerns about the impact, expressed concerns that now organizations on the ground, including government officials, are a little bit worried and are engaging in some level of self-gagging and self-censorship as it relates to reproductive health policies in the countries. And this we saw particularly very, very concretely, we saw it concretely and deepened in Kenya and in Nigeria. And if you remember in the previous slide that we shared, Kenya and Nigeria have a significant investment by the US government in terms of foreign policy and foreign assistance. And so what we saw from respondents was that partners were refusing to put and to advance conversations on abortion rights in part of government technical working groups. We saw that certain issues and certain policies were not being pushed to the forefront and shared with the public and moved into the public arena, and also implementation, because they're like, look, we already had the gag rule, and now if the US government which they're not looking at this as because within the context, people are not looking at it that this is a Supreme Court decision. It's the United States as a whole. So with the removal of Roe versus Wade through the Dobbs decision, it's signaling that the United States, in terms of its soft power, is not advancing sexual and reproductive health and rights. So why should we take this on board, and particularly abortion rights? And so this is something that's really concerning for us, and the confusion that a domestic policy is also going to have impact on foreign policy and on foreign aid in country is something that we really need to unpack in our engagement with the US government. Next slide, please. So in terms of the second research question focused on public narratives, what we saw definitely was that in all 4 countries, the anti-rights movement picked and chose when to use anti-imperialist and anti-colonial messaging. So what we saw was anti-rights actors using anti-colonial messaging to argue that abortion, LGBTQI rights, assisted reproductive technologies, and comprehensive sexuality education are foreign influences and foreign agenda that is actually being put to undermine moral, cultural, and also reduce population as part of a neo-colonial agenda. And I think this is something that is not new to all of us. We know that this is their strategy. But at the same time, they reference the United States as a good example, as a standing example, a moral example that we should emulate when it comes to abortion rights. So for example, when I mentioned earlier about the Lagos guideline, what we saw was the anti-rights agenda selectively adopting an anti-imperialist stance and utilizing political, economic, and cultural influence of the United States and emphasizing the importance of African values being retained when it aligned with its agenda. But then when it did not, they would then say, it's really important for us to look at these more advanced nations, more advanced countries that are more resourced and emulate their actions when it suits them, like in the case of the Dobbs decision. Next slide, please. And while we saw that on one side, we also saw on the other side about how there is a lot of public narrative around the notion of national pride and the fact that we are doing better than the United States. Many countries cited that, and we saw that particularly in Colombia and in India. And, you know, if you remember my earlier slide in which I explained the context, the legislative context and the legal framework, you have countries like Colombia and India who have more favorable frameworks for the provision of abortion. And so one of the things that we heard from interviewees was that countries felt like, look, we're doing much better than the United States. And in India particularly, there was a lot of comparison made to the progress with the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act amendments, which recently included unmarried persons as being able to access safe abortion, and felt that this is a positive step compared to the regression that's being faced in the United States. In Colombia, we saw, respondents expressing pride in the recent gain and said the feminist movement in the region is really critical and has really made, promising advances to also counteract this global backlash. So seeing it as an external influence to sexual and reproductive health and rights. And even though we saw that in Colombia, I think this whole notion of national pride also extends to the region as a whole as well. And so this was sort of like a flip side to what we were seeing in countries like Nigeria and in Kenya. Next slide, please. So in terms of the movements, and we really wanted to make sure that we were sharing with you some of the findings that highlighted, the impact of Dobbs on the mobilizing, strengthening, and providing momentum for the growth of anti-rights movements and support for anti-rights actors. And in all 4 countries, we learned from interviewees, from respondents, that the anti-rights movements are being emboldened since the overturn of Roe versus Wade, and that anti-abortion actors in particularly are deepening their campaign of misinformation, reinforces anti-abortion narratives and ideologies, and are specifically pointing to Dobbs to push the validation of their position. And anti-rights movements are using similar strategies, we heard, across these different countries, from strategic litigation to creating a chilling effect for providers through criminalization, intimidation, but also, interestingly, with a specific and targeted approach to grooming young people into their anti-rights ideology. In Colombia, anti-rights organizations initially felt a huge defeat when the constitutional courts decided to liberalize abortion. However, after that, we saw with the overturn of Wade, a rejuvenation of their efforts to ignite the abortion debate. And they've continued to invest in disseminating misinformation, drawing on references to the United States, and also capitalizing on media confusion around this. What we saw as well in India was shortly after the Dobbs decision that there was the first March for Life that took place to commemorate 51 years of the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act of 1971. This was the first in India, and the press release from the march quoted a spokesperson from the organization Right to Life UK, stating that it's an exciting time for the pro-life movement in India. As we're seeing the end of Roe versus Wade, it presents us with an opportunity and a cause of hope, because it demonstrates that countries like India, which have these kind of unjust laws, can also be overturned. So you can see that it's giving people some sort of like a guiding light and a reference point to see what is possible. Because I think, we've all come to the point in the past to see Supreme Court decisions as sacrosanct, as not being able to be changed. And now they see the possibilities with the overturn of Roe versus Wade. The other thing that we also saw in terms of Kenya was that, the anti-rights movement are using this as well as their way of mobilizing across geographies and transnationally on the continent, and particularly engaging with counterparts, anti-rights actors in Uganda and Tanzania, and using similar tactics by introducing and influencing legislation, but also attacking service providers as they're delivering their services, even under the existing remit of the law. Next slide, please. And then on the other side, what we also saw was that the opportunities provided by the Dobbs decision allowed for SRJ activists to use this as a teachable moment, as an opportunity to talk about abortion and to raise awareness about national laws and its drawback. And we saw this particularly in Colombia and in India, where the laws are more favorable. In India, where there is a high level of misinformation about abortion legality and the amendments to the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act, a lot of the interviewees and respondents consider this as a positive and a unique opportunity to engage with people, engage with the public through newspapers, radio, social media, and community discussions about the importance of the existing law, but also the shortcomings of the existing law, and opportunities to be able to expand it, to be able to ensure that it's more inclusive and also meets the needs of those most marginalized and in the helms of society. For Colombia, one of the things that interviewees also noted was that with the overturn of Roe versus Wade, it was a stark reminder to the feminist movement in Colombia that the ongoing importance of abortion advocacy, that we can't necessarily be comfortable in the gains that we've had, but really sort of help them to think through the importance of educating and raising more awareness with the public about the significance of the court ruling as a critical milestone that needs to be protected and to be retained at all times. And the final thing, I think, around movement building, as you've seen, and we've seen through many interactions and engagement, is just the fact that even in Colombia and in Argentina, as my CEO Giselle had mentioned, that with the overturn of Dobbs, many feminist movements, especially within Latin America particularly, are seeing this as an opportunity for cross-regional exchange and learning, to be able to build a stronger movement in the region. And we're also seeing this also coming up in other regions in Asia and the Pacific, in Africa as well, but also using and learning and building on the learnings from Latin America to be able to push the conversation even more forward, and helping to make sure that we localize learning and also localize the advancement, and to take a decolonized approach to what we are seeing in the United States. Next slide, please. So my final point, really in terms of the research, is looking at the impacts of Dobbs on movements, but particularly in terms of funding. And several interviewees expressed concerns about the potential decline in funding and support for global abortion initiatives. And they highlighted that, you know, for many of them, a lot of their resources does also come from the United States, and concerned that private philanthropy, especially in the United States and in other countries where right-wing political victories have occurred, that there might be a shift to want to focus more inward, to counteract the anti-rights movement within their own nations and within their own countries. And one respondent specifically shared that their organization had already experienced this shift, and an effort to redirect support for colleagues and addressing new demands in the United States, given the urgency that came with the overturn of Roe versus Wade. Another element that, you know, partners and respondents in Colombia, Kenya, and Nigeria mentioned was that the belief that Dobbs would have an effect on US government funding, similar to the global gag rule. And the funding concerns were even more acute for local and grassroots organizations who are already facing constraints that are remnants from the global gag rule, even though it was overturned and was rescinded by the current administration, but feared that with the overturn of Roe, that new cuts would be introduced as a result of that. We saw that there was less influence on India in terms of resourcing, and many of you know the context within India, and even lesser, to a lesser extent compared to the other three countries, lesser influence of the transnational anti-rights and anti-abortion network in that particular country. So I think it's really important for us to think about, you know, how, you know, this particular decision affecting access domestically in the United States, but it's also having that same, you know, ripple effect in terms of access, in terms of funding and resourcing in terms of the global South. So I want to, that pretty much sums up the findings that we have. And I just want to let you know that later today, we're going to be releasing a brief fact sheet that summarizes these findings that I've shared for you. And later on this year, we'll be releasing the full report of the findings and recommendations. But I wanted to actually share right now some very concrete recommendations to the global donors and to civil society. And then my colleagues from Colombia, India, Kenya, and Nigeria will provide specific recommendations to governments, including their governments, in a few minutes. But next slide, please, Kat. So in terms of core recommendations for global donors, and looking specifically at both bilateral donors, multilateral donors, and philanthropists, individual donors as well, and private philanthropy. One of the things that we think is really important is for us to increase funding for feminist initiatives, driving narrative change to support a comprehensive and intersectional SRHRJ agenda, recognizing the influence of public narrative on policy. And that's really, really critical. I think we need to see and to recognize that the work of the anti-rights and anti-gender movement is not being constrained by geography. And because they're working in a transnational way, investments, resourcing needs to be transnational as well, needs to model that, and not one that pits one geography against another. We need to invest and do more funding and more resourcing for reproductive justice organizations in the United States. And we need to also step up investments for resourcing feminist movements in the global South and create opportunities for that interaction and engagement that is more transnational and can be better positioned to respond to the way that the anti-rights and anti-gender movement are also pushing back and making headway. And so I think that's something that we need to be able to continue to sing and to share to global donors, that their investments should not be an either or, but it needs to be a collective sort of approach. We want to see more resourcing going to not just setting up feminist mechanisms for tracking the anti-rights movement, because it's really important to be able to have evidence and data, but also to support the collaboration and the collective response that comes from that. And what we've seen is a lot of investment right now, to a certain extent, maybe not necessarily at the national level, but at least at the global level on the monitoring. But we've not seen an equal or similar amount of investment in the response. And that's what we need to be doing now. It's the response that needs to be resourced and needs to be resourced adequately. And then in terms of our recommendations to civil society, I think it's important for us to capitalize on this global momentum for sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice, regardless of whether they represent a gain or a loss, and to cultivate support for a broader transnational reproductive justice agenda that transcends geographies and locations, and to be able to work together more concretely in collaboration on, like I mentioned earlier, not just monitoring, but also in terms of collaboration and strategizing for mitigating harm, but also in terms of advancing feminist narratives so that we're not always in response to the opposition, but that we're out there and we're championing and allowing the public and communities to truly understand the importance of and the centrality of sexual and reproductive rights and justice to all the other issues that we want to achieve, and has been a central part of human rights. So I'm really looking forward to our engagement. I'm going to stop here. Happy for us to pass it on to my colleague, who's also going to moderate the question and answer, but also specific responses from our colleagues from the different countries where this research took place. Thank you so much. Back to you, Bergen.
Thank you so much, Kemi. That was a really impressive presentation of findings. And as Kemi said, and as Giselle said, we're really excited to make these findings actually actionable. To that end, the fact sheet that Kemi mentioned is available, and we will be sharing it in the chat throughout the rest of the webinar. We are very excited that Ambassador O has been able to rejoin. For those of you who didn't hear her bio earlier, please rewind. Which reminds me, this is live streamed on YouTube. So in case your friends weren't able to join today, you will be able to share a link with them. And I'd also like to remind everyone, I do see some questions coming into the Q&A box. Please continue to use the Q&A box so we can get to your questions at the end of the webinar. So Ambassador O is the Ambassador at Large and the Secretary General for Generation Equality Forum, Beijing 25. Ambassador O, let me hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Bergen, and apologies for the glitch just before. For some reason, I was connected as a participant, but not as a panelist. So I was actually hearing you, but I could not speak. Thank you so much, Kemi, for this fascinating, very, very interesting presentation. I learned so much. What I kind of suspected after Dobbs took place, but which you really substantiated with evidence, with these interviews, and with the plea that you're making for donors and the international community to continue both funding and sustaining these feminist movements. I'm going to change a little bit what I was going to say, because now I was going to introduce the topic, but I wanted to kind of really follow up on what you were introducing, and take the liberty to talk about my own country, France, because there's been also some interesting developments after the overturn of Roe v. Wade, and I didn't want to miss on mentioning that, also to give us some glimmer of hope, as you have highlighted the number of negative consequences and impacts of the Dobbs decision in Kenya and Colombia, in India and Nigeria. Well, in some other countries, such as France and other European countries, there's been quite actually a positive reaction to the overturn of Roe v. Wade. And to tell you, before the Dobbs decision, there was talk within the political community, the political world, of inscribing the right to abortion in the Constitution. So we've had abortion rights since 1975. It's been a while, but it's only a law, and we see that any kind of law can be repealed. And so there's been calls for actually a decade to inscribe the right to abortion in the Constitution. And I would say there was no really serious listening from politicians and decision makers. And after this happened in the US, now it has been taken on by the majority party in France, and the president has announced that the right to abortion will be inscribed in the Constitution, which will make it, as has the US example has shown it, not intangible, but much less, more or less defendable from any kind of change of majority. So we hope to see that happening either this year or next year. And it's a huge step because feminists had been calling for that for a long time. So just I wanted to share this with you because it's so important, and because we see that everywhere, even in countries that have the right to abortion, like us since 1975, so it's like almost 50 years, we also know that the backlash is always possible. So now back to my subject, which is the Generation Equality Forum. I assume that most of you are kind of familiar with what the Generation Equality Forum is or was. It was this 25th anniversary of the Beijing conference. Is very important, the largest feminist gathering and international conference on gender equality since the Beijing conference. It took place 2 years ago in 2021. It was co-hosted by France and Mexico under the aegis of UN Women. And how is it related to our topic today is that we decided that we would have 6 major topics, and one of them, of course, was sexual and reproductive health and rights. And how is it important and how was it kind of historical is that in that coalition, first of all, we had long discussion whether to include the right to abortion, because we know that this is so controversial. This is also such a topic that is so uneasy to talk about in many parts of the world. But we very much insisted that it might be one of the 3 main pillars of the Action Coalition on the sexual and reproductive health and rights. The second reason, which gives us hope also in this context, in historical context, is that we collectively managed to bring on board countries that do not have the right to abortion, but that still joined the coalition and made some commitments on these issues, on family planning in general, on sexual and reproductive health and rights in general, but also on abortion. And I'm thinking particularly of Burkina Faso, which is not the biggest and the most famous country in the African continent, which is kind of even a small country than the biggest Francophone country of Western Africa, like Senegal, but which made important commitments towards family planning, access to contraception, even to post-abortion care in a country where abortion is actually not legal. And so since then, we've seen that Burkina Faso has been able to take the lead of a group of 5 to 6 Western African countries, including Senegal and Mali and Niger, that have kind of followed up the lead, the regional lead, in order to advance progress, especially on family planning, not specifically on abortion rights, because abortion is not legal in any of these countries, but we see that we can make progress with a regional leader, with the help of a regional leader on these issues, and has opened up conversations that were not necessarily possible before. Now, 2 years down the line, where are we? We've done a lot of progress together also with UNFPA. There's a lot of funding that goes towards sexual and reproductive rights through UNFPA, and especially UNFPA supplies. We will have a midpoint moment at this year's UN General Assembly, which if you are in New York, I would like to invite you to attend, which would be the 2.5 years anniversary of the Generation Equality Forum. There will be new announcements and new commitments by previous commitment makers, but also new commitment makers, and specifically within our Action Coalition on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we've also decided with this coalition to kind of come forward more, I wouldn't say aggressively, but more openly about our support to abortion. And more specifically, you'll see coming out very soon a letter of an open letter, public letter of support to the Beatriz case, which is, as you know, being right now judged by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in El Salvador, in Costa Rica, but for a case that took place in 2013 in El Salvador for a young woman who had who couldn't have an abortion because of the law in El Salvador. And so we also decided that we need to be more overt in our public and political support in cases which may be, very important, such as the Roe v. Wade, but in the other way. So thank you very much, and apologies again for coming off topic, but I hope this was helpful. And thank you so much to Fòs Feminista for inviting me.
Oh, thank you so much, Ambassador O, and I'm so glad that you could be here and be overt in political support. I know that we have hundreds of people listening on Zoom and on YouTube, and I think we're all going to show up at UNGA in September and see you and hear these new commitments. Now, I think it's time for me to take a break. So let me hand it over to my colleague, Kat, who will moderate us through the rest of the session. Kat, over to you.
Thanks so much, Bergen. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Thank you, thank you. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in community with you all today. My name is Catherine Olivera, pronoun she, her, ella, and I am the Associate Director for U.S. Global Policy at Fòs Feminista. So I have the pleasure of co-moderating the second half of today's webinar. And as Kemi mentioned, we will now be unpacking a bit more from each of the four respective countries. So I have the honor of introducing our first speaker, Daniel Arango, Research Associate at Fundación Oriéntame. Daniel Arango is a historian from the National University of Colombia and a specialist in public policies and gender justice from Glasgow. He has experience working with interdisciplinary groups on qualitative and quantitative research projects with different communities in Colombia. Daniel, thank you for taking the time to join us here today. Could you please tell us a bit more about what these findings mean in relation to Colombia and what recommendations you have for the government of Colombia?
Thank you, Catherine, and thanks to Fòs Feminista for the invitation. So, as Kemi showed before, in February 2022, the Constitutional Court decriminalized abortion up to the 24th week and retained the 3 exceptions for the rest of the pregnancy. With this ruling, Colombia now has the most progressive framework in Latin America. However, despite the new ruling, barriers persist in women's access to safe abortion in Colombia. Barriers include lack of awareness of the new ruling, restrictive interpretation of the legal framework by providers, and failures in the provision due to inadequate staffing, access to medication, or poor infrastructure. In addition, social stigma continues significant in the country, and which leads women to continue to seek out illegal providers just to avoid being seen entering an abortion clinic. This overview of the situation in Colombia allows me to present the first 2 recommendations. The first one is to implement strategies to disseminate information to the public on the implications of the ruling to combat misinformation, remove barriers to access, and fight social stigma. The second one is to educate service providers on the legal and technical implications of the ruling, as well as the latest technical regulations and best practices for conducting the proceedings safely. To refer to the third one, I must say that in August last year, a new president came into office. This is the first time in the country's history that we have a left-wing president, and many people see this as a unique opportunity to make the long-awaited changes that the society needs. However, the scenario so far has been bittersweet, as the new president has been embroiled in several scandals that have weakened his governability and damaged his public image. In addition, his commitment to women's rights and causes championed by feminist groups has been timid, to say the least. With this, I can mention the third and final recommendation for the Colombian government, which is express a clear position of support for the ruling and strengthen the political capital that supports it. Finally, I just want to emphasize that the feminist movement is strong in Colombia and has achieved many important gains in recent years. However, it is important to achieve greater integration between the different groups in order to work together to truly represent the needs of all women in the country. Likewise, despite the important victories achieved, it is important to continue working and strengthening these victories to avoid setbacks in access to SR-HRJ.
Gracias, Daniel. No, we do know for sure that the feminist movement in Colombia is resilient. The Marea Verde is alive and strong there, and we look forward to future advocacy and initiatives from Colombia. So we will move on to our second speaker, Dr. Alka Barua, abortion theme lead at Common Health. Dr. Barua is an independent consultant with a medical degree in pediatrics and a doctor in sociology. She has more than 30 years of experience as a researcher in public health, particularly in the area of reproductive and child health. She currently leads the abortion theme in Common Health, which is a consortium of 300 individuals and civil society organizations. Dr. Barua, thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you. Could you please tell us a bit more about what these findings mean to you in relation to India, and what recommendations do you have for the government of India?
Thank you, Catherine. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending on where you are. In terms of these findings, I just wanted to emphasize that, objections to abortion are not new in the country. When they first appeared, they appeared due to decline in population of a specific religious group in one of the states in the country. And but that opposition was not very aggressive. It was not very obvious. What this particular ruling in the United States has done is it has brought it into the public domain. And post this judgment, the movement has gained momentum, and they are trying to co-opt the anti-sex selection agenda, the disability groups. They are talking about the eugenic motives of the act. They are leveraging our other acts and programs which have some conflation with our Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act. And what is even more alarming is it's no longer restricted to one religious ideology, but it's spreading across other religions because we are seeing growing conservatism in India. So that is what it is. My particular coalition, Common Health, has certain recommendations based on the work we do, our larger efforts to improve access to safe abortion services for all those who need these. And within the existing legal and policy context to begin with, we have short-term recommendations where we are asking for similar things that my predecessor talked about. We would like to advocate, or we are actually advocating with the government to create awareness about services and social protection entitlements of those who are seeking the services. Address the myths, misconceptions through the outreach services. We believe that normalization of conversation around abortion as any other health service will go in a long way in addressing the stigma. Second is, of course, creating awareness about the recent amendments and the health service provider obligations under the amended law and any other law that is related. We are also advocating for ensuring availability of abortion services as envisaged under the amended law, including counseling and everything else under the public sector. Of course, availability of contraceptives of choice for those who want this. At the legal and policy level advocacy, we are talking about advocating for revision of the language which is being used in the Act currently to go beyond the gender binaries. Though the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice did mention it in his ruling, we are talking about an act passed by the Parliament where the language has to be revised. We are also advocating for alignment of conflating laws and some baffling programmatic commitments that lead to chilling effect. For that, we are talking about very clear standard operating procedures and guidelines which have still not been revised by the government. We are talking about reviewing of existing information education material, the comprehensive abortion care guidelines, so that they align with the amended act and they take into account what has been said in the court and what has been committed by the government. At the medium term level, our advocacy is going to be for self-managed abortions, as the Guttmacher data has shown that more than 75% of our abortion services are self-managed and outside the legal purview. So perhaps, it's time to include these as legitimate, include abortion in telemedicine, as well as do away with the third-party authorization, which the current amended act talks about. And in the longer term, we believe that abortion rights dialogue will not happen till we remove sections from the Indian Penal Code. We therefore plan to continue dialogue and debate on decriminalization of abortion, for which, like-minded people have got together. We have a coalition which is working towards it. So that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burra. I really appreciate your insights and recommendations regarding creating awareness on the existing framework, the existing legal framework, and how we can ameliorate it, on top of the call for demedicalizing, destigmatizing, and normalizing abortion, including self-managed abortion. Thank you so much for your remarks. We'll switch into our third speaker. I have Ijeoma Iguatu, Director of Data, Innovation, and Communication at Generation Initiative for Women and Youth Network, GWIN. Ijeoma is an activist currently with GWIN as director, again, with more than 10 years of experience focusing on sexual and reproductive health and rights of young people. She is one of the driving forces in the establishment of her organization's reproductive health hotline, and as well as a research site coordinator for IBIS Reproductive Health in partnership with GWIN. She has co-authored journal articles and has participated and presented in conferences, seminars, workshops on SRHR nationally and internationally. She attended Madonna University in Nigeria, where she obtained a Bachelor of Science degree. Ijeoma, thank you so much for being with us today. It's a pleasure to have you. Can you please tell us a bit more about what these findings mean in relation to Nigeria and what recommendations you have for the government of Nigeria?
Okay, thank you so much, Catherine, and everyone for having me. So happy to be here. So for me, I would say that this research is timely, especially coming in this period where there's a total disregard for international human rights standards that should be the tenets of abortion. So the research has demonstrated to us a good understanding of the Dobbs decision on abortion laws, policies, and narratives, especially in Nigeria. So it has given us like an opportunity to explore like the trickle-down impacts on abortion, and also gain more knowledge in our context of the policies and laws and anti-abortion movements, owing to what Kemi just mentioned, that the Lagos State guideline was taken down 9 days after the Dobbs decision due to pressure. So this has also given us, like, it gives us a voice to give, do our recommendations to the government. So for the recommendations, I would recommend that the government and policymakers should reinstate the Lagos State guideline for safe termination of pregnancy on legal indication and adopt the guideline in other states as well in Nigeria. So the government should also strengthen capacities of health providers to use the guideline in provision of safe and legal abortion, including providing abortion value clarification and attitude transformation workshops. So this research, this recommendation also goes down to that the government should expand grounds for accessing safe abortion to include rape, incest, physical, and mental health. So it will give, because this guideline, when restated, will give more flexibility for accessing safe abortion and give a clear national protocol to healthcare providers, thereby preventing unnecessary harm to women's health, as well as shape ideas and thoughts. So that's my recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ijeoma. I really appreciate you speaking on the importance of how we say in the United States, right? Making lemonade out of lemons, in the sense that using this opportunity to really cultivate and cultivate on the opportunities that we see forward to push the agenda. So thank you so much. Our next speaker is Ms. Brenda Otieno, a Research and Data Management Coordinator at KMET. Brenda is a doctor and philosophy candidate in a program design, learning, and evaluation specialist with over 12 years of experience implementing research and programs for various organizations locally and internationally. These include Rugstan in Somalia, Massachusetts General Hospital, Center for African Family Studies, UN Mission in DRC, UNFPA, UNAIDS, amongst others. She also has a Master in Science and Public Health and a basic degree in Bachelor of Science in Biomedical Sciences and Technologies with a specialization in medical biotechnology. Thank you so much, Brenda, for being here today. Could you please tell us a bit more about what these findings mean in relation to Kenya and what recommendations you have for the government of Kenya? Additionally, in your remarks, could you please share some recommendations that you do have for the United States government?
Thank you very much. And thank you all for all the information that you have gotten this day. It was a good presentation on the findings from the different countries. And I think similar to other countries like Nigeria that we are seeing, at least we know that Kenya is not far off. We are facing similar challenges, even with our communities and the narratives within. Like in Kenya, the narrative is the same. We have been having a very strong anti-rights narrative with people speaking against abortion rights because of our culture and our traditions. But then we also appreciate that with the Dobbs decision, it has given us an opportunity to create awareness on abortion care. It has given us an opportunity to have a conversation on the same, and also an opportunity for both anti-right movements and the pro-rights to just look at the current national laws that we have and see how best we can advance SRHR justice for our population. So for us, basing on some of the findings that we have today, I think we need to recommend to our government, especially our Assembly and the Ministry of Health, to review and restate the national reproductive health policy that we are having. Last year, we passed a reproductive health policy, which is an umbrella on where to provide reproductive health for our population, which did not have any mention of abortion care, be it access, be it commodities, be it financing. And we believe that for us to advance SRHR justice for our population, and of course, to increase access to safe abortion care, then we'd have to review that policy as per the written national constitution, so that we are having care and we are advancing reproductive health rights for the citizenry. So first, one of our recommendations would be to have that policy reviewed. Secondly, when you look at our constitution, abortion is permitted under some legal laws or legal provisions, and one of them is permitted under any other written law. As it is currently, most of the laws that we are having around are punitive and punishing to the abortion service providers. So we would also call on the government to relook at these other written laws so that we are having written laws that support provision of safe abortion care within the country. And some of those laws that we are looking at would also protect our healthcare providers, because currently as it is, most of the healthcare providers and facilities that are providing safe abortion care are normally criminalized. They are punished, they are harassed. We have cases where they close up those facilities and they put them in bad light. But then when we have these written laws that even explains the provisions that are provided within the constitution, then we'll ensure that our healthcare providers are safe and they have a framework through which they can offer their services without any fear or intimidation. Finally, I think for the Kenyan government, again, would request that they reinstate the national guidelines on reducing maternal mortalities and morbidity from unsafe abortion in Kenya. Previously, we had a guideline which they would use to ensure that we are reducing maternal mortalities from unsafe abortion. But as it was highlighted by the presenter from the presentation, we realized that at some given point, they are even revised the policies so that we are not even looking at unsafe abortion as one of the big 5 causes of maternal deaths in the country. So somehow those policies and guidelines were shelved, and they decided to criminalize abortion care. But then we are calling upon the government to reinstate the guidelines and ensure that we are focusing also on a safe abortion as one of our big 5 killers of our women. So thank you very much. Catherine, back to you.
Thank you, Brenda. Really appreciate you making the call that abortion is paramount in our efforts to combat maternal mortality, and as well as there cannot be reproductive health and rights without abortion care. Brenda, could you also please share with us the recommendations you have for the U.S. government recognizing the wealth of power that the U.S. has, in the region of your country regarding U.S. foreign assistance? What recommendations do you have to share?
For the United States government, for us, would recommend that they have an executive action, especially from the White House, to explain on the Dobbs decision. Currently, we do understand that with the decision, there's been a lot of confusion. There's been lack of clarity on what they mean. And the majority of people interpreting it as USA saying abortion is illegal. But then we would like an executive action from the White House to explain that with the Dobbs decision, it does not mean that abortion care is illegal. And of course, it does not impact on the Biden government's support to sexual reproductive health and care. And of course, also for us who implement projects from the US government, it does not necessarily mean that now any organization that is implementing any abortion care services or abortion care related interventions, that now we need to stop or have that gag. So I think for us, the first thing would be on the clarification on the Dobbs decision from the White House and what it means in terms of implementation and in terms of the resources that we are being given. Secondly, I would call on the American government to increase funding, especially when it comes to sexual reproductive health and rights interventions. We do know that previously we had a global gag rule, which already reduced some of the fundings, because most of the organizations that depended on fundings from American countries, they lost their funding due to the global gag rule. But then we do understand that the Biden government, of course, promotes sexual and reproductive health and rights. So we'd call on the government also to increase on funding when it comes to sexual reproductive health and rights. Secondly, we'd also, third, we'll talk about the permanent revocation of the global gag rule. Currently, I know the anxiety and the tension, especially with the Dobbs decision, would be that there will be a reinstatement of the global gag rule. But then to protect implementation and implementers, especially from countries that are not even in America, like the US assistance and all that, we'd like to see some legislative actions or some legislative policies from the American government revoking the global gag rule permanently. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda, so much for those concrete recommendations to the U.S. government. Completely concur that we need clear communication from the White House. We need increased funding for sexual and reproductive health and rights. And as well, we need to permanently end the global gag rule through legislative action, recognizing that any administration can reinstate the policy again. So thank you so much, Brenda. So we are going to switch now into Q&A, but before we do so, I did want to take this opportunity to introduce Monica Edwards. Monica Edwards, pronoun she, her, is a reproductive justice policy advocate, writer, and spokesperson. She is currently the Director of Policy and Advocacy at In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. Monica received her Bachelor of Arts in Criminal Justice from the University of Alabama, with her Juris Doctor from the University of Alabama School of Law. Monica, thank you so much for being here today. We've heard so much about the global impacts of Dobbs in this webinar, but we did want to take some time to truly recognize how this is playing out domestically. So can you please share with us a bit about how the decision has impacted women of color, particularly Black women in the United States and across the South, so the state of abortion in the South? Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you so much, Kat. And just want to concur everything that has been said, and thank you all to all of the expert panelists sharing both the findings as well as your recommendations. Yes, again, my name is Monica Evers. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm with In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. In Our Own Voice is a national state partnership whose mission is to increase and highlight the leadership of Black women on reproductive health, rights, justice issues. And I want to shout out our state partners across the US, Black Women for Wellness, Black Women's Health Imperative, New Voices for Reproductive Justice, Sister Love Inc., Sister Reach, Spark Reproductive Justice Now, the Afia Center, and Women with a Vision. Yes, of course, Saturday marked 1 year since the Supreme Court's decision in the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. And in that decision, the Supreme Court pretty much ignored decades of precedent, overruling its 1973 decision in Roe versus Wade. And with that, obliterating a constitutional right, leaving people with the capacity for pregnancy to the mercy of their local and state policymakers and entities. Since the decision in Dobbs, domestically, just talking about a little bit of the impact, there are at least 13 states and counting where abortion is effectively banned. In addition to the 9 states whose trigger bans or pre-Dobbs abortion bans went into effect immediately, additional states utilized their 2023 state legislative sessions by attempting to further ban and restrict access to abortion. And in some of these states, these measures passed. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention some of these states are the same states during their legislative session this year where they also chose to target transgender young people trying to play sports. They are attempting or have passed measures to ban gender affirming care. They are attempting to silence classroom discussions about LGBTQ plus folks. And they're also attempting to rewrite history and ban any mention of critical race theory, Black history, or just conversations about the US and its colonialistic and white supremacy history. As a Black woman from Alabama, where abortion is currently banned, I would not be painting a clear picture without saying this, and that is that abortion bans and restrictions do not impact people equally. And a little bit about RJ, or reproductive justice, if that term is new to you, Sister Song Women of Color Collective out of Atlanta, Georgia defines reproductive justice, or RJ, as the right to have children, the right to not have children, and the right to parent the children we do have in safe and sustainable communities. And this human rights framework and movement was started by 12 Black women when the existing feminist and women's rights movement, which were largely centered around the needs of cisgender white women, failed to meet the needs of the most marginalized communities. And so decades since that movement was founded, we find ourselves in a post-Dobbs climate where, again, the impact is not equal. For Black Americans, exposure and experiences with racism already accounts for early health decline. When it comes to abortion and Black women specifically, it is us who are disproportionately impacted. Black women seek abortion at higher rates and disproportionately live in states in the US where abortion is banned. And we're not the only ones impacted. Latinas, at least 6.5 million Latinas live in states where abortion is banned. And according to our partners at NAPA, the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, at least 1/3 AAPI women live in states where abortion is banned. Young people now are forced to navigate parental involvement laws and pre-Dobbs restrictions in now a post-Dobbs world. Queer and transgender people are forced to navigate this post-Dobbs world where, frankly, often the conversation around abortion does not include them. They're also forced to deal with a discriminatory healthcare system, and that is on top of continuous attacks at both the state and federal level against transgender youth and transgender adults. And if you notice, I have not often said a post-Roe world, and I just want to be frank because the reason that I'm not saying a post-Roe world is because the reality is that legally, for the communities I just named, many of which are my communities, we have been living in a post-Roe world. Even before the decision in Dobbs, state legislators have incrementally passed restrictions on abortion for decades. Many of these states are in the South and Midwestern regions of the US, which has the largest population of Black Americans and are near our southern border. And I would argue that that is not by coincidence, but by design. To be frank, the US was founded upon white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism. Attempting to control one's bodily autonomy, specifically of marginalized communities in the US, is not new, and that can be seen with our country's history of violence against Indigenous communities, enslavement, and xenophobia. So as we discussed the 1-year anniversary of Dobbs and these amazing findings and recommendations from the expert panelists, it is clear that the impact goes way beyond the US. As it relates to the US, I don't have a one-fix-all solution, nor do I think there is one. We cannot fix what we refuse to acknowledge. And the only way forward for the US specifically is to acknowledge our violent and oppressive history and work toward solutions with those communities who are most impacted. One of our members of the US House of Representatives, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, often says, those closest to the pain must be closest to the power, and they must be closest to the solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica, for your powerful testimony. It's nothing but the truth, and we just want to thank you for really speaking, this truth into power right now. So really appreciate you being here today. I just really think that it's important to recognize, right, the truth that we're now navigating with the pre-Dobbs restrictions in the post-Dobbs world, not post-Roe world, like you had mentioned, because Roe was never, the ceiling. It was just the floor, and we need to do much more than Roe. So thank you so much, Monica. We will now open up to questions and answers, recognizing the time that we do have. We do want to take into account the questions and the comments that are coming in from the audience. But before opening it up to question and answers, I did want to take the opportunity to once again acknowledge the incredible contributions of the consultants who supported this work, Chitra Nagarajan and Paula Trujillo Gonzalez. Chitra and Paula, thank you so much for your incredible contribution to this work. We really appreciate your efforts. So with that, we can kick off Q&A. I see some questions already coming through, so I will go ahead and ask the first one that is directed to Kemi. So Kemi, did you see any patterns in misinformation across the countries?
Yes, thanks so much, Kat, and thanks to the person that put that question forward. We did. There was a lot of similarities in terms of the strategies being utilized by the anti-rights and anti-abortion actors and movements, from things that range from personal testimonies that delegitimize access to abortion to, graphic imagery. These are not new stuff, because I'm sure for those of you, for example, our colleagues and siblings in the United States and in Latin America and the Caribbean, these are things that have been circulating long time. And so these are still continuing to be used a strategy, but what we've also seen is a certain level of sophistication in terms of now using science and data to be able to support their narrative and to support their agenda. And the conversation I mentioned earlier about targeting anti-colonial and anti-imperialist using that as justification, even though the actors are exports. They are exports, and they're the ones telling Global South communities and countries and activists that they should be wary of the United States or be wary of Western agenda, but they're from there. So, but not to necessarily say that alone, they are also interacting and engaging with local actors as well on the ground. And I think that is what makes it extremely challenging. So yes, we did see those patterns across the different countries, but of course it took different dimensions based on several things: language, religious makeup of the country, in terms of also the state of the feminist movements as well in those countries. I think those dynamics affected the way that we've seen the organizing and engagement of anti-rights and anti-abortion actors. Back to you, Kim.
Thanks so much, Kemi. So our second question, either Daniel or Alka can answer. So we have a question asking, it would be great to hear a bit more about how people in Colombia and India have mobilized the national pride and national benefit into a narrative for rights, especially as we've heard the flip of how anti-rights movements are using Dobbs? Daniel or Alka? So just a bit more about how Colombia or India have mobilized the national pride and national benefit into a narrative for rights.
Well, at least in India, we have for last how many 9 years, we have a very sort of growing nationalism, which believes in a very sort of moving away from Western ideology, Western culture, Western influence. So it's not something which is specifically meant for this particular issue, but this also sort of aligned with a prevailing sort of sentiment which was already there about nationalistic fervor in place. So I wouldn't say it is particularly related to this, but I don't know, maybe my colleague Souvik would like to come in and say if he wants to say something related to this.
Here in Colombia, I mean, since last year, it has been really important, the mobilization that the feminist groups have made, especially regarding the new ruling. I feel that Causa Justa and the movements that were related to the new ruling have really congregate a lot of people and have given like a specific personality and a clear path in which the different groups can move. So that has been really important here in the country to congregate the different feminist groups and the different initiatives that they all have, and build together like a stronger force to move in the country.
Kat, you're on mute.
Apologies, I thought I unmuted myself. So our next question is related to the US, so it was directed to me. So we've talked a little bit about the global gag rule already, but could you talk a little bit about how this could affect global aid from the US for sexual health in the long term? So I think, as mentioned already, we know about the global gag rule and its chilling effects, but I think what's very important to recognize is that unfortunately there are a lot of anti-abortion US policies and US foreign assistance. And what we've seen in our findings is that there's confusion and conflation amongst many of them. The global gag rule, including as well as the Helms Amendment, which prohibits the use of US foreign assistance for abortion. So a lot of what we see during hostile and restrictive environments and administrations is the US telling organizations what they cannot do, right, because of these restrictions. We rarely hear about what's permissible. And I think that that lack of communication is what's not being received from those on the grounds for them to know what they can actually exert within their power and of their national law, and as well as what's permitted through US law. So that's what our recommendations are calling for a clear communication from the White House, communicating the impacts of Dobbs, really clearly stating that the Dobbs decision has no impact on US foreign assistance, right? Also clearing up the confusion that exists in the chilling effect from the global gag rule and the Helms Amendment, as well as what's permissible under the Leahy Amendments, which is, these are conditions in which US foreign assistance can be used for abortion. And these are in the instances of rape, life endangerment, and when the pregnancy is not viable. So again, we need this clear communication coming from the White House regarding what Dobbs doesn't do and how it doesn't affect and what's currently permissible. I think really recognizing as well as the fact that the global gag rule can come into effect at any moment is what keeps this unstable and it does not permit for sexual and reproductive health and rights programs to be sustainable. And that's what we need for the health and lives of people. It needs to be sustainable. Therefore, we need a permanent end to the global gag rule and other anti-abortion US policies. Kemi, I see your hand is up, so don't know if you did also want to contribute a bit to this answer.
Yeah, just to also, put out the greater call for, this is the moment that we expect the United States to increase its commitment to SRHR. Given what the Biden administration knows happened under the Trump administration with the eroding of feminist movements, with the disengagement of partnerships, and with weakening of civil society, we expected that with the Biden government coming into place, that we would see that greater investment to rebuild as part of a way of payback for what has happened. And also as a way to prepare movements and to prepare organizations if in the future, we have a restrictive government taking over the White House. So this is not, we've seen a lot of commitments from the US government, especially its commitment around the Action Coalition for bodily autonomy, sexual and reproductive health and rights, in which they made a lot of commitments under this GEF framework to supporting reproductive justice. But we're not seeing that translating into actual resourcing on the ground. So this is the call we need to see them do. Put your money where your mouth is. Invest in feminist movements on the ground. Fix the mess that was created.
Thank you so much for that, Kemi. Yes, definitely agree. We have one last question, recognizing time. So did this research uncover any connections between the anti-abortion and the anti-LGBTQI rights movement and actors? Kemi, I think you can answer this one. I think this one was directed to you, but also do want to create space for others to answer if they do have any thoughts. But if not, Kemi, please go ahead.
No, I was going to actually ask, Dr. Alka to speak, because we did see this in the case of India with the same-sex marriage equality bill. I don't know, Dr. Alka, would you like to go? Thanks.
Well, yes. In fact, even the March for Life, which they conducted this march in August 2022, there were these posters which talked against contraception, and there were posters which had slogans against same-sex marriage and relationships. And that is where they are trying to spread the entire opposition to issues related to sexual and reproductive rights, and not restricting themselves to abortion alone. And you quoted the Chief Justice of India, where even the government representative talked about the Dobbs judgment in the context of same-sex marriages in the court, but fortunately there was a pushback from the Chief Justice of India. So hopefully, for the time being, at least there is a pushback, but we don't know whether this will continue, and it does seem that it might continue. The reason being, this particular movement in India is not only building momentum, but it has also realized that it has to move beyond a particular religion. It is moving away from the church. It's trying to co-opt the other religions as well. And, the religious ideology is undermining science, medical technology, medical education. And, it is also co-opting well-known and reputed institutions, medical institutions. And that is giving legitimacy to the entire movement and this kind of opposition to sexual and reproductive health rights. And that's a very dangerous a landscape full of landmines where we are heading right now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alka. Really appreciate your thoughts there. So I think we're a bit over time. So I did want to thank everyone for their participation in this webinar. Thank you to everyone who took the time to attend, as well as our audience members. Before closing, I do want to remind folks that, again, we do have fact sheets available with the preliminary findings, as well as the recommendations that were laid out by our partners in this call today. The fact sheet will be translated in other languages as well to ensure accessibility for many communities. And again, that this report will be fully released at the end of the year. So again, these are preliminary findings, and we are eager to share with you all the full report once we have it readily available. So thank you again to all the panelists, the speakers who took their time. It's been a pleasure to be in community with you all today. And again, let's use the energy, let's use this moment to really, start co-conspiring even more, co-creating futures, because at the end of the day, it's us who takes care of each other at the end of the day. We are a community, we're a feminist community, and we're here for each other. And again, it's been a pleasure being in community with you all today. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.